Hello everybody. Let's talk about something else, another cool simple video tip. Let's talk about your story. Now, when you start talking about story, all the crazy things in your mind come to mind, and you start getting really complex and it can get really involved. But the key is to keep your simple story simple. And how to do that is very simple. Does everybody know the old nursery rhyme, Little Miss Muffet? All right, here it goes. Little Miss Muffet sat on her tuffet, eating her curds and whey. Along came a spider and sat down beside her and frightened Miss Muffet away. Everything you need to know how to make a simple story is right there in Little Miss Muffet. Matter of fact, the guys at Marvel Comics, that's what they would tell all their writers in the bullpen. And when I say the guys at Marvel Comics, I'm talking about Jim Shooter and Stan Lee, those guys. This is how it works. It's really simple. I'll break it down like this. Little Miss Muffet sat on her tuffet, eating her curds and whey. Now that's the beginning of the story. Those are the first things that you have to know. You have to kind of set it up for the audience. Who is it, right? Who's the character? Well, in this case, it's Little Miss Muffet, right? Where is she? What's the setting, right? She's sitting on her tuffet, and her tuffet is like a little pillow, right? And then the last bit that you have to know, the plot, is what is she doing? Well, she's eating her curds and whey. So Little Miss Muffet sat on her tuffet eating her curds and whey are the primal necessary elements to start any story. You have your character, you have the setting, the place the story is taking place, and you have the plot or the action of the story. Simply having plot and character and setting doesn't make a story. What makes a story is conflict, right? You have to have some kind of problem. And so the next thing that's introduced, and it has to be introduced after you've introduced those first three things, is you introduce the conflict, right? And so we introduce Along Came a Spider. Now, the Along Came a Spider, right, is introducing kind of that bad guy character, the antagonist, if you want to get technical about it. And the bad guy character is the spider. Along came the spider. But that doesn't really start any conflict, because if along came a spider and he sat down across the room, right, unless it was a giant spider, there's not really much conflict there. So it has to be very specific and concrete. Along came a spider and sat down beside her, right? It sat down right next to Little Miss Muffet. Now that's the key piece to it, right? He wants to sit on the same tuffet where she's sitting. That's where your conflict comes into play, right? Now, after you've established that conflict and you've established kind of the bad guy or the antagonist, like who's causing the conflict, right? Now you have to have some kind of climax. Now, the climax in a story is typically, you think about it in a movie, it's like an explosion or something like that. But what it really is, climax of any story is kind of the emotion part of it. It's what we really want the audience to feel at the end of the story. Now, in this particular nursery rhyme, like a lot of nursery rhymes, our fear is that big emotion that we're going to experience. So along came a spider and sat down beside her, right? And frightened, right? And frightened. So she gets this big fear. So we have this, you can imagine Little Miss Muffet, screaming to the heavens. And then we have the action, which is kind of like the wrap up. They call it, there's a fancy French word which I refuse to use that writers like to throw around. We'll just call it the resolution, or the end of the story. And that resolution at the end of the story is frightened Miss Muffet away, right? She ran away. So we have that kind of end, and that ties up the story, and everybody knows what happened in that story. So the key to telling any story, simple stories are the best stories, is you have to have these items. Plot, you have to have a character, and you have to have a setting, a place where the story is going to be taking place. Now, those three things can be introduced in any order. It doesn't really change the story, right? It might change the nursery rhyme, but it doesn't really change the story. We could say eating curds and whey on her tuffet was Little Miss Muffet. Now, that doesn't make a really good nursery rhyme, but that tells the same story, right? Once you have those three things introduced, your plot, your character, and your setting, then you introduce your conflict and your antagonist or your bad guy in the story, right? And so those two can be introduced in any order. But in a simple story, you usually want to introduce your bad guy before you introduce your conflict. It makes it easy to read to see where the conflict's coming from. So you introduce, the spider, and then it sat down beside her, wants the same chair, right? And so that's pretty specific. Those two can be flipped around, but it's best in a simple story to introduce your antagonist first. Then you have your climax of your story, and that's the emotion. That's where the problem is solved. So that's our climax. And then the resolution, and like I said, she was frightened away, or she squishes the spider, or she shakes hand with the spider. It depends on the story you're telling, but it has to happen in that order, right? So that's how you tell a super simple story, Little Miss Muffet.